If you've lived in your home for 20, 30, maybe even 40 years, there's a good chance that what you're dealing with doesn't really feel like a clutter problem. It feels more like your life, sitting quietly in boxes and corners around you. You might have a box with your mother's dishes that you've held on to for years, not because you use them, but because they remind you of her. Somewhere else, there's probably a stack of your children's school projects that you've carried through multiple moves, even when you weren't sure why you were keeping them. There may be a section of the garage with tools that belong to someone who is no longer here, and a part of your closet still holding clothes from a time in your life that feels both familiar and distant at the same time. When you look at it that way, it becomes clear pretty quickly that this isn't the same kind of clutter people usually talk about. And when someone suggests something simple, like starting with one drawer or following a checklist, it doesn't really reach the heart of what you're dealing with. Because this isn't just about objects, it's about what those objects carry with them. So instead of trying to simplify this into a quick system or a set of rules, it makes more sense to slow it down and look at it honestly, not just at what needs to be done, but at why this feels so difficult in the first place and what actually makes it easier to move through without forcing yourself into it. If you take that approach, the process becomes less about clearing things out and more about understanding what you're holding on to and why. And this is where a lot of people get tripped up right at the beginning, often without realizing it. There's a quiet assumption that if things have built up over the years, it must come down to discipline. That maybe at some point you should have stayed more organized or kept better track of things or dealt with it earlier before it reached this point. But when you really look at what's in your home, that explanation doesn't quite hold up. What you're seeing isn't the result of a lack of discipline. It's the result of time. The first shift that makes this whole process feel different is understanding that this isn't a discipline problem at all. It's a decades problem. When you've lived in one place for a long time, things don't accumulate all at once. They build slowly, almost without notice, over years and years. You raise children, and along with them comes a constant flow of physical things that felt important to keep at the time. School papers, clothes, small projects, items tied to specific moments that didn't seem disposable when those moments were still close. You move through different phases of life, and each phase brings its own set of needs. There are times when holding on to extra things makes practical sense, and times when you simply don't have the energy to go through everything because there are more pressing responsibilities to deal with. Then there are the things that come from other people. Items you inherit from parents or relatives, not just because you need them, but because letting go of them feels like letting go of the person. Objects tied to memories, to milestones, to experiences that mattered, and still matter in a quieter way. None of that happens in a single moment, and none of it feels like a problem while it's happening. But over time, without any one decision causing it, the volume grows to a point where you start to notice it differently. You look around and realize that your home is holding the story of decades, not just of your own life, but of everyone connected to it. And when that realization sets in, it's very easy to turn it inward and think that maybe you should have handled things differently. But if you step back and look at it honestly, this didn't happen because you were careless. It happened because you lived a full life in this space. Starting from that understanding changes the entire tone of the process. Because when you approach this from a place of guilt, it tends to drain your energy before you even begin. You either avoid it completely or you push yourself too hard in short bursts, and neither of those approaches really lasts. But when you approach it from clarity, when you can acknowledge that this is simply what a lived-in home looks like over time, the work begins to feel more grounded. It's no longer about correcting something that went wrong. It's about adjusting your space so it fits where you are now. It still takes effort, and it doesn't become easy overnight, but it becomes something you can actually stay with. You didn't fail at managing your home. You lived in it, and that's an important difference. Once that shift settles in, something else starts to become clearer. And this is where the process begins to take on a more practical shape. Because the next piece isn't really about how you organize things. It's about why you're doing this at all. A lot of advice in this area focuses on appearance. Clean surfaces, tidy rooms, everything arranged in a way that looks organized and controlled. And while that can be satisfying on some level, it's usually not what actually motivates someone to start this kind of work or to continue with it when it becomes challenging. What tends to come up instead, when people are honest with themselves, is something quieter and more personal. It might be the thought that you don't want your children to be left with the responsibility of sorting through everything one day. It might be the frustration of not being able to find things when you need them, or the sense that your home no longer feels as comfortable or manageable as it once did. Sometimes it's simply the feeling that things have become heavier than they need to be, and you'd like a little more ease in your day-to-day life. Those reasons don't have much to do with how things look. They have to do with how it feels to live in your space, and one of the more difficult but important parts of this is the awareness that, at some point, someone else may have to go through what you leave behind. That's not an easy thing to think about, but it does bring a certain kind of clarity. It shifts the process from being something you should do to something that actually serves the people you care about, as well as yourself. At the same time, it's important to be realistic about what this involves. This isn't something that gets resolved in a few days, and it doesn't move in a straight line. There will be moments where you don't feel like dealing with any of it, and others where you come across something that makes you pause longer than you expected. That's part of how this works. But when your reason is clear, when it's rooted in something that genuinely matters to you, it becomes easier to return to the process without feeling like you're forcing yourself through it. There's also a more immediate side to this that often gets overlooked. When a home becomes very full, it begins to create small amounts of friction in everyday life. Things take longer to find, certain areas become harder to use, and even basic tasks like cleaning or moving around can require more effort than they should. You might not notice it all at once, but over time, it adds up. This isn't about having a perfect or minimal home. When it's about having a space that works with you, rather than one that you constantly have to work around. When there's a little less in your environment, everyday life tends to feel easier in subtle but meaningful ways. You move more freely, you spend less time managing things, and there's less mental noise competing for your attention. That shift doesn't happen instantly, but once it begins, it's noticeable. So before you start going through anything, it helps to pause and get clear on your reason for doing this. Not a general reason, but a personal one. Because on the days when the process feels slow or uncomfortable, that's what you'll come back to. And more than anything else, that's what keeps it moving forward. Once your reason becomes clear, on the next part of the process is where things can either start to feel more manageable or become overwhelming very quickly, depending on how you approach it. This is also the point where a lot of well-meaning advice begins to lose its usefulness, not because it is wrong, but because it doesn't fully account for what you are actually dealing with. Most organizing systems suggest working by category or by room. You start in the kitchen, move to the bedroom, then the living room, and so on, working through the house in sections. On the surface, that sounds logical and straightforward, but when your home contains decades of accumulated life, that approach can quietly create a kind of pressure that is difficult to sustain. Because the real challenge here is not identifying what something is or where it belongs. The challenge is deciding what it means to you now. And that is a very different kind of decision. So the next shift that makes this process feel lighter is learning to sort by meaning rather than by category. When you go room by room, you often find yourself moving back and forth between very different types of decisions without any separation between them. You might begin by sorting through something simple, like extra kitchen utensils, and within minutes you find yourself holding an object that carries a strong emotional connection. Switching between those two states repeatedly can be surprisingly draining, even if you don't fully realize it at the time. Over the course of an hour or two, that mental and emotional shift adds up, and it is one of the main reasons people feel exhausted or stuck after trying to just get through it. A more manageable approach is to separate your belongings based on the kind of attention they require, rather than where they are located. In most homes, things tend to fall into three broad groups. There are items that are purely functional, things you use regularly that do not carry much emotional weight. These are everyday objects that serve a purpose and are usually easier to evaluate without much hesitation. Then there are items that hold meaning, things connected to people, memories, or specific periods in your life. These require more time and a different kind of focus, because the decision is not just about usefulness, but about what the object represents. And finally, there are items that do not fully belong to you, things that were left behind by children, stored temporarily by others, or passed on to you without a clear decision about whether you actually wanted them. These often involve more than just sorting. They involve communication, context, and sometimes boundaries. When you begin to separate your decisions in this way, something shifts. You are no longer forcing yourself to handle everything at once. Instead, you are working within a single type of decision at a time, which is far less draining and much easier to stay consistent with. In practical terms, this can be very simple. You might spend one session going through a small group of functional items, such as a drawer or a shelf, where the decisions are straightforward and do not require much emotional energy. On another day, when you feel more settled, you might choose one small container of meaningful items, not an entire room, just one box, and give yourself the time to go through it without rushing. And on a separate occasion, you might focus on items that belong to someone else, which could begin with a conversation rather than immediate sorting. Approaching it this way reduces the pressure to do everything at once and makes it easier to continue over time. Even with this structure in place, there is one area that consistently slows people down, and it is worth taking the time to approach it carefully rather than trying to move through it quickly. That area is anything sentimental, because this is where the process shifts from being practical to deeply personal. You might pick something up and find that it is not just an object, but a connection to a person, a moment, or a version of your life that still feels meaningful in some way. And most advice in this area tends to simplify that experience more than it should. Suggestions like keeping only what brings you joy or replacing an object with a photograph can be helpful in certain situations, but they often do not fully match the emotional weight of what you are actually dealing with. Because a photograph does not replace the physical presence of something that has been part of your life for years. So rather than trying to force a quick decision, it often helps to shift the question slightly. Instead of asking whether you should keep something, it can be more useful to ask what role it is playing in your life right now. Some items are still active in your life. You use them, you see them regularly, and they continue to have a place in your daily experience. Some are still genuinely meaningful, even if they are not used often. They are things you value, things you might display, or return to occasionally in a way that feels intentional. But there are also items that remain in your space primarily because letting them go feels difficult, even though they are no longer actively part of your life. This is where the process becomes more subtle. Holding onto something out of obligation rather than connection or use can slowly turn it into a kind of weight, even if that weight is not always obvious. Recognizing that distinction takes time, and it is not something you need to resolve immediately. In fact, it is more realistic to expect that some items will take longer than others. Well, you may come across something and not be ready to decide, and that is completely fine. Setting it aside and returning to it later is part of the process, not a failure of it. Over time, with a little distance, the emotional intensity around certain items often softens just enough to make the decision clearer. Working through sentimental items is rarely a one-time event. It is something that unfolds gradually, and allowing it to unfold at its own pace makes it far more manageable. Alongside that, there is another category of belongings that tends to remain in the background, but can take up a significant amount of space, both physically and mentally. These are items that belong to other people. In homes that have been lived in for many years, it is very common to find boxes or belongings that were left behind by children and stored for relatives or simply never claimed again after a certain point. These items often stay where they are because addressing them feels uncomfortable. There can be a sense that you should not make decisions about something that does not belong to you, or that bringing it up might create tension. At the same time, keeping everything indefinitely creates its own kind of pressure. So the next shift is understanding that you are not responsible for storing other people's belongings forever. That does not mean making sudden decisions without involving anyone. It means opening the conversation in a clear and respectful way. Something as simple as letting someone know that you have come across their things and that you would like them to decide what they want to keep is often enough to move things forward. Some people will come and go through their belongings. Some will tell you they no longer need any of it. Others may want to keep a few specific items. All of those outcomes are workable. What tends to create the problem is avoiding the conversation altogether and allowing those items to remain in your space without any clear decision. The same principle applies to items that were passed down to you. Just because something came from someone you cared about does not mean you are required to keep all of it indefinitely. In many cases, those items were passed on with the hope that they might be useful or appreciated, not that they would become something you feel obligated to hold on to. Taking the time to ask yourself whether something genuinely matters to you or whether you are keeping it out of a sense of responsibility can help you make more honest decisions about what stays and what moves on. Finding a different home for something, whether that is with another family member, through donation, or simply letting it go, does not take away from where it came from. It simply allows your space to function in a way that better supports your life now. And that balance between honoring the past and living comfortably in the present is really at the center of this entire process. By the time you reach this point, it is very normal to feel that everything you've heard makes sense, but at the same time still feels like a lot to take on in real life. That feeling doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. It simply reflects the size of what you're dealing with. Because you're not just sorting through objects, you're working through years of decisions, memories, and responsibilities that have built up gradually over time. And this is often the point where people make a choice that seems reasonable, but ends up making things harder than they expect. They wait for the right moment to do everything at once. It might be a free weekend, a stretch of time when the house is quiet, or simply a day where they feel motivated enough to finally tackle it all. The idea is that if they can just push through in one strong effort, they will get to the other side of it and be done. But in most cases, that's not how it plays out. At the beginning, it usually feels productive. You're making decisions, clearing space, and it feels like things are finally moving. But as the hours go on, the physical side of it starts to catch up. You're bending, lifting, sorting, moving things around, and that effort builds more quickly than expected. At the same time, the mental side becomes more demanding. Each item requires attention, and after a while, that attention starts to wear thin. You begin to second-guess decisions, or you make quicker ones just to keep going, and by the end of it, you're often left feeling either exhausted, overwhelmed, or uncertain about some of the choices you made. And that experience has a lasting effect because it makes it harder to come back and start again. So the next shift is not about doing more, but about changing how you approach the pace of it. Small and steady tends to work far better than trying to do everything at once. That doesn't mean making dramatic progress in a single day. It means choosing something that has clear boundaries and feels manageable, and giving it your attention without pushing past the point where you start to feel drained. That could be a single drawer, a shelf, or one box from a larger area. When you approach it this way, you stay within your capacity, both physically and mentally. You are able to make decisions more clearly, and you are less likely to reach the point where you feel rushed or overwhelmed. Just as importantly, it makes it easier to return to the process. When a session ends in a way that feels contained and reasonable, instead of exhausting, there is less resistance the next time you think about starting again. Over time, that consistency becomes far more effective than any single large effort. It's also important to be honest about how this unfolds. There will be weeks when you don't feel like doing anything at all. And there will be sessions that feel slower than others. That's not a sign that it isn't working. It's simply part of working through something that has depth to it. What matters is that you come back to it when you can, without putting pressure on yourself to do it perfectly. Even small steps taken regularly create movement, and gradually, without forcing it, you begin to notice the difference. Certain areas feel easier to use, decisions become a little more natural, and the overall weight of the process starts to ease. From there is one final shift that tends to bring everything into clearer focus, and it goes a little deeper than the practical side of things. Many people carry a quiet belief, often without saying it out loud, that holding on to someone's belongings is a way of holding on to the person themselves. It can feel as though those objects keep the connection present, and that letting them go might somehow weaken that connection. That feeling is completely understandable. Objects do hold memory, and they can bring back moments in a way that feels immediate and real, but over time, something begins to change. When items are no longer used, or even noticed very often, they stop functioning as active reminders. Instead, they become part of the background while still carrying the emotional weight they once had. And this is where it becomes helpful to look at the difference between keeping something and honoring it. Keeping everything is not the same as honoring everything. Meaning doesn't spread evenly across every object connected to a person or a period of your life. It tends to settle in certain things, items that still feel connected in a present and tangible way. It might be something you use regularly, something you've chosen to keep where you can see it, or something that still carries a clear sense of connection when you come across it. Those are the things that continue to hold meaning in a real way. But when everything is kept without distinction, that meaning can become diluted. Instead of a few strong connections, there is simply a larger volume of items, many of which no longer play an active role in your life. Over time, that volume can begin to take up space not only in your home, but in your attention as well. So instead of trying to keep everything as a way of preserving the past, it often becomes more meaningful to identify what truly represents that person or that time for you now. Keeping those things allows the connection to remain clear rather than spread thin. At the same time, It helps to remember that the people connected to these items are not contained within them. They exist in your memory, in your experiences, in the ways they shaped your life and who you became. Letting go of an object does not remove that. If anything, it can make those connections feel more distinct because they are no longer surrounded by excess. None of this makes the process easy. There will still be moments where you pause or feel unsure or decide to come back to something later. That is part of working through something that has real meaning behind it. But when you approach it gradually, with a clear sense of what matters and what doesn't, it becomes something you can move through. And instead of something that stops you completely, and when you step back and look at all of this together, the goal becomes a little clearer. It's not about creating a perfect home, and it's not about removing everything that doesn't serve a strict purpose. It's about shaping your space so that it supports your life as it is now. A space that feels easier to move through, easier to maintain, and more comfortable to spend time in. A space where the things around you are there because they truly belong, not because they were never addressed. That kind of change doesn't happen all at once. It develops gradually through small and consistent decisions over time. So rather than trying to take on everything at once, it is often enough to begin with something simple. One drawer, one shelf, or one box. Start there and allow that to be enough for now. And if this is something you have been carrying for a while, take a moment after this and think about the one area in your home you've been avoiding the most. Not the whole house, just that one place. And instead of trying to solve it immediately, just sit with it for a few minutes and notice what comes up. Because that's often where the real starting point is. If you feel comfortable, you can share that in the comments. And if this kind of conversation is helpful to you, you can support the channel in a simple way by liking the video, subscribing, and turning on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. There's more like this coming, and I'd like you to be part of it. Take your time with this. There's no need to rush.